Welcome to the debate. To start things off today, there is a town in south central Nebraska called Hastings, and it perfectly illustrates the conceptual logic at the heart of our discussion. Back in 1927, an inventor named Edwin Perkins sat in his kitchen on West First Street and figured out how to concentrate enormous flavor potential into a highly deliverable powdered form. He called it Kool-Aid.
Right. And what's fascinating about that specific stretch of prairie is what happened just 15 years later. The United States government looked at that exact same geography and used it to concentrate 40% of the entire U.S. Navy's World War II munitions into these massive hidden concrete igloos.
Precisely. The logic across both of those historical footnotes is actually identical, even if the applications couldn't be, more different. The core idea is to concentrate enormous potential, whether it's generative or deeply destructive, into its absolute simplest, most deliverable form. And then you just step back and let physics do the rest.
Which brings us to the reality of the skies right now. Today is Sunday, March 8th, 2026.
Yeah, just last month on February 5th, the New START treaty officially expired. For the first time in half a century, we are operating without a binding nuclear arms control framework. And this is happening at the exact moment that SpaceX's Starship architecture is driving orbital launch costs down by a staggering factor of 5,400. I mean, we're looking at projections as low as $13 to $32 per kilogram to low Earth orbit.
Which means we have firmly, irreversibly arrived in the era of orbital kinetic bombardment. We are talking specifically about 20-foot-long, 12,000-kilogram solid tungsten cylinders dropped from orbit striking the Earth's surface at Mach 10.
Exactly. So the central question we are debating today is what this hardware actually means for our survival. Does the sheer economic accessibility and the legal ambiguity of these orbital kinetic platforms inevitably collapse global deterrence, creating an unstoppable first-strike weapon that plunges the world into a lethal strategic vacuum?
Or
does their dual-use potential as planetary engineering tools force a necessary radical evolution in human governance? I look at this exact same physics, and I don't just see a doomsday weapon. I see a revolutionary mechanism for the centennial collapse terraforming model, which will force humanity to transcend Cold War deterrence and forge a completely new paradigm. Well, let's start with the physics of the weapon itself, because we really need to ground this in the undeniable destructive math. And honestly, the physics here is essentially a first-year university homework problem. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 times mass times velocity squared.
Right, it's entirely foundational. There are no exotic explosives here.
Exactly. When you take a 12,000-kilogram mass of tungsten, drop it from orbit, and let gravity pull it down to Mach 10, the velocity term in that equation becomes catastrophic. That impact produces kinetic energy equivalent to 11.5 tons of TNT. But what makes this so uniquely destabilizing is the legal architecture, or rather, the complete lack of it. Look at the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It strictly and explicitly bans placing nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but it says absolutely nothing about a solid metal pole. Under current international law, an electromagnetic railgun sitting in low Earth orbit is legally classified as a propulsion system, and the tungsten rod? That's just a mass.
It's essentially classified as inert cargo until the very second it hits the ground.
Right. It's a massive legal loophole. And then you combine that legal vacuum with the economics. Because of the total collapse in launch costs we just mentioned, a fully operational platform carrying 6 of these rods, complete with a nuclear-powered railgun launcher, costs roughly $210 to $250 million to deploy. We are taking an unstoppable, unregulated doomsday mechanism and converting it into a highly accessible tactical asset for the price of 2.5 fighter jets.
I won't lie, the accessibility of it is staggering. $250 million is an absurdly low number, but we have to reframe the intent behind this exact same math. You look at a 20-foot, 12,000-kilogram rod, and you see the ultimate bunker buster. I look at it and see a seismic probe. I see a geothermal initiator. I see a crustal carbon sequestration tool. That Mach 10 impact is the critical key to the centennial collapse model for terraforming Venus.
Moving mountains on another planet is a beautiful concept in theory, but how does dropping tungsten rods actually sequester carbon?
It's all about the crustal geology. Venus has a supercritical carbon dioxide atmosphere that traps heat and makes the planet an absolute hellscape. The centennial collapse model proposes putting a constellation of 20 railgun platforms in Venusian orbit. You fire 30,000 of these kinetic penetrators a year into the surface. And what happens when you liquefy the Venusian crust at that scale? You excavate deep, fresh calcium and magnesium silicates. When those newly exposed silicates come into contact with a supercritical carbon dioxide atmosphere, an immediate chemical reaction occurs. The math shows it would sequester roughly 1.8 times 10 to the 14th power kilograms of carbon over a 50-year period.
So you're essentially using orbital kinetic bombardment to crack open a dead world and force an artificial carbon cycle.
Yes, this technology is not inherently a weapon. It is planetary engineering. Because it possesses this extreme dual-use capability, its deployment acts as a profound forcing function for our species. To wield a tool like this, humanity has to adopt what is described in geopolitical theory as a Yisrael posture.
The biblical metaphor of wrestling with immense power.
Exactly. Wrestling with it collectively. It forces us into an ongoing covenant where we must manage this capability through transparent, cooperative global governance, rather than retreating into the obsolete, isolationist silos of the nuclear age.
I see the elegance of that vision. I really do. But let's talk about those silos and bunkers for a moment, and what happens when you point this hardware at Earth instead of Venus. Let's look at the specific mechanics of the offset nose weight, because this is the detail that actively destabilizes global security today.
Ah, the asymmetrical design.
Right. If you drop a perfectly symmetric 20-foot tungsten pole, it penetrates the ground like a nail. It drives downward incredibly hard, but eventually the sheer surface area of the shaft grinding against the channel walls creates enough friction to stop it. Shaft friction is the limiting factor for traditional penetrators. But aerospace engineers solve that by deliberately breaking the axial symmetry, essentially placing a small, dense mass slightly off-center in the nose of the rod. They completely change the physics of the descent. Imagine spinning a top that has a piece of heavy gum stuck to one side. It wobbles, right?
It precesses. It carves a wider path.
Exactly. That wobble or precession turns this falling telephone pole into a massive hypersonic drill bit. The tip traces a tight circle, cutting a channel through the Earth that is slightly wider than the rod itself. This completely eliminates shaft friction. The sides of the rod never touch the rock. It allows the penetrator to self-correct on oblique impacts and to bore hundreds and hundreds of feet underground. It literally liquefies reinforced concrete ahead of it.
It's a terrifying piece of fluid dynamics, I agree.
It is, and it directly threatens the absolute deepest command bunkers on Earth. We're talking about facilities like Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, or Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, or the deep subterranean command structures in Russia and China. For 70 years, the entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction has relied on one thing: the survivability of second strike command authority.
The idea that even if your country is glassed, the leader survives deep underground to push the retaliation button.
Yes. But if the crust of the Earth can no longer protect that command authority from a conventional, non-nuclear decapitation strike, the foundation of deterrence evaporates. It actively invites a first strike attack. The adversary knows your bunker is no longer safe. Why wouldn't they strike first?
Because the obsolescence of those deep bunkers is actually a strategic necessity for our evolution. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the fact that the kinetic drill can reach Cheyenne Mountain is exactly what we need. Think about the historical metaphor from Revelation chapter 6. The kings of the earth hiding in caves, begging the mountains to fall on them to protect them from the fallout of their own decisions.
You're saying the bunker itself is a moral hazard?
It's an entirely outdated, pathological security model. We have spent the last 7 decades allowing the world's military and political elite to build deeper and deeper caves, functionally separating their personal survival from the survival of the biosphere. The offset nose kinetic drill proves that the crust of the Earth can no longer grant them that separate peace.
So by erasing the viability of the deep bunker, you force them to care about what happens on the surface.
Exactly. It demands that nations abandon the illusion of isolationist deterrence. It literally forces them out of the caves. If you can no longer hide your command authority under a mountain, you have no choice but to engage in transparent, cooperative orbital governance. The destruction of the bunker isn't the end of security. It's the end of Cold War paranoia that we desperately need to outgrow.
That is a fascinating psychological frame, but getting nations to abandon deterrence and cooperate assumes they will actually know who they are supposed to be cooperating with. Or more precisely, who just destroyed their command bunker. Which brings us to the absolute nightmare of the attribution problem.
You're talking about the warning time.
I'm talking about the fact that nuclear deterrence only works because attribution is immediate and obvious. When a country launches an ICBM, that rocket produces a massive blazing infrared plume. Defense support program satellites see it instantly. Ground-based early warning radars track the trajectory. You have minutes of warning to identify exactly who fired it and from where. Retaliation is assured. But orbital rods don't have launch plumes.
None at all.
None. The platform has been sitting in orbit for months, blending in perfectly with 12,000 other active commercial and military satellites. When it's time to strike, a tiny retrograde thruster fires, simply nudging the rod out of orbit. Gravity takes over. It drops silently into the atmosphere. The first time ground radar picks it up, you have exactly 11 seconds of warning before it impacts at Mach 10.
11 seconds from radar detection to total destruction.
11 seconds. The response window closes before the attribution window even opens. And remember the economics we discussed earlier? $250 million for a fully loaded platform? We aren't just dealing with superpowers anymore. Mid-sized corporations, sovereign wealth funds, rogue private military contractors, they could comfortably afford to put a dozen of these in orbit. Deterrence fails completely if you can identify the attacker before your central command structure is wiped off the map. You can't retaliate against an anonymous strike.
That 11-second warning time is genuinely chilling. I concede that. But you have to consider the sheer scale of the infrastructure required to actually claim this technology for its proper generative use. You are worried about a rogue corporation sneaking one of these into orbit? But the prior climber of this hardware is planetary engineering, and you simply cannot hide a planetary engineering campaign.
But a rogue actor doesn't need to terraform Venus to hold Earth hostage. They just need one platform.
True, but the moment this technology is commercialized, the legitimate infrastructure required to execute the Centennial Collapse model on Venus will dominate the domain. We are talking about 400,000 metric tons of orbital infrastructure. It includes 50 independent laser platforms, generating 20 gigawatts of continuous power just to photochemically dissociate the carbon dioxide. It includes 20 acoustic resonance platforms featuring 500-meter reciprocating pistons to create planetary-scale standing waves in the Venusian atmosphere.
You're describing an industrial revolution in space.
Exactly. And it requires massive, highly visible asteroid mining operations just to source the 4 million metric tons of tungsten needed for the kinetic rods. You cannot build, operate, or maintain a supply chain of that magnitude anonymously. Because the technology is distinctly dual use, because the exact same railguns terraforming Venus could technically be pointed back at Earth, it absolutely necessitates the creation of an international monitoring consortium.
So the massive scale of the Venus project effectively creates an umbrella of transparency?
Yes. The very risk of the anonymous 11-second strikes you mentioned is the exact catalyst required to force the creation of a global space preservation treaty. The infrastructure is too massive, the supply chains are too obvious, and the stakes are too high for it to remain unregulated. You simply can't hide 4 million tons of tungsten.
I hear that, but it assumes we have the luxury of time and diplomacy to build that international consortium before someone decides to exploit the vulnerability. In reality, humanity is currently operating in a completely defenseless physical and legal vacuum. Let's look at the sheer impossibility of countermeasures.
You don't think we can shoot them down?
I know we can't. Ground-based mid-course interceptors are designed to hit predictable ballistic missiles in the vacuum of space. They cannot intercept a telephone pole-sized object moving at Mach 10 through the atmosphere with only 11 seconds of terminal warning.
What about directed energy weapons? Or kinetic fragmentation?
Even if you manage to hit it, fragmenting a 12,000 kilogram solid tungsten rod at hypersonic velocity doesn't neutralize the threat. Think about it. You hit the rod with a missile, it shatters. Now, instead of a single deep penetrating drill bit, you have just created a hypersonic shotgun blast of jagged tungsten fragments traveling at Mach 10, widening the surface destruction across an entire city.
It spreads the kinetic energy over a wider footprint.
Exactly. You cannot shoot it down without making the surface damage worse. Combine that physical defenselessness with the geopolitical reality we mentioned at the top of the show. On February 5th, the New START treaty expired. There is no verification architecture left. We are operating in an entirely unregulated domain where defense is functionally impossible and treaties have evaporated. We are completely exposed.
I understand the anxiety around that exposure, but the absolute impossibility of military defense is exactly what makes the terraforming vision not just viable, but inevitable.
How does being defenseless make terraforming inevitable?
Because military defense against these rods is a mathematical dead end. Pouring trillions of dollars into a new arms race of space-based interceptors or laser grids is futile. It will only accelerate the compression of the decision timeline. First it's 11 seconds, then it's 5, then it's 0. The only rational allocation of human resources at that point is outward. Look at the financial cost of coordinating these kinetic strikes with orbital mirrors and the teraton-scale thermonuclear devices required to create atmospheric earthquakes on Venus. The entire centennial collapse model costs roughly $100 billion a year to operate.
$100 billion a year is massive.
It sounds massive, but it is just 0.1% of current global GDP. In fact, it is actually less than what the United States currently spends just on maintaining its legacy nuclear arsenal.
Wait, terraforming Venus is cheaper than maintaining our current nuclear stockpiles.
Yes. When you reach a point where countermeasures are literally physically impossible, and the cost of planetary expansion is cheaper than the cost of maintaining obsolete doomsday weapons, the impossibility of defense becomes a feature. It's no longer a bug. It forces human civilization to look at this hardware and make a definitive, binary choice. We either use this unregulated physics to destroy ourselves and in our cames, or we use it to create a second habitable world. The terror of the weapon forces the choice of creation.
As we draw this discussion to a close, I think it's vital to highlight where our perspectives definitively converge, because the baseline reality of this technology is staggering. We're in complete agreement on the inescapable physics of the Mach 10 spin-stabilized tungsten rod.
The mathematics of kinetic energy are undeniable.
And the catastrophic collapse of orbital launch costs practically guarantees that these platforms will be deployed in the very near future. We also completely agree that the hardware itself is entirely agnostic to its target. It doesn't care if it's hitting Venusian silicates or a command bunker in the Rocky Mountains.
It is just a rock falling from a great height.
Exactly. However, we remain in deep tension regarding the inevitable outcome of this technological reality. I maintain that the complete lack of launch signatures, the terrifying 11-second warning time, and the gaping loopholes in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty will plunge humanity into a highly unstable decapitation strike arms race. The temptation to exploit the sudden vulnerability of deep command bunkers is simply too high, and the structural failure of deterrence in a zero-warning environment is too profound to ignore.
And I maintain that this exact strategic instability is the necessary catalyst we have been waiting for. The fact that the deep bunkers are no longer safe, and the fact that defense is mathematically impossible, is exactly what will compel humanity to step up. We are looking at a system that can literally move mountains, excavate dead riverbeds, and unlock the solar system for human habitation. The terrifying nature of the weapon is the forcing function that will push us into that Yisrael posture, wrestling with this immense power until we forge a new, transparent framework for human governance.
It is a profound complexity to consider. A single piece of hardware, a solid tungsten cylinder sitting silently in orbit, acting simultaneously as the ultimate tool of human extinction and the ultimate tool of human expansion. It represents the oldest weapon in human history, dropping a heavy rock on your enemy, scaled up to the absolute limits of fluid dynamics and orbital mechanics. We highly encourage everyone to look closer at the engineering, the treaties, and the geopolitical realities we've discussed today to fully grasp the delicate balance of this dual-use physics.
The sky above us is entirely contested, and the decisions made in this specific decade will determine whether that physics is pointed downward at our own bunkers or outward to build new worlds. It is a question that belongs to all of us.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous intellectual exchange. We leave the ultimate conclusion to you. Until next time.